So I'm Ellie Knowles with Flow, and I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, Amber Fredenburg. Um, Amber came to Flow last spring asking if we had any spots in our uh, pollinator gardens and properties that she could run an experiment on. And we said, of course. And soon, strange little plots of land with little sticks and piles of rocks and tents and things started showing up in little containers of sugar water. So we've been waiting anxiously to see what is coming out of all this. Amber is working on her PhD at OSU in evolution, ecology, and I hope I say this right, organismal biology.
Mhm.
So she's doing research to identify the resources that attract ground nesting bees so we can provide habitat for them. A lot of our native ground nesting bees are endangered or at least declining, so the more habitat we can offer, the better. So I'm going to turn it over to Amber.
Hi, thank you, Ellie. Yeah, so I have like a 20-minute talk to give you guys about just some general overview about bees in general, and then also some of the results of my research. So let me go ahead and pull that up. Starts all the way at the bottom. Here we go. Okay, so there are over 300 native species of bees in Ohio. A lot of the times people think about bees, they think immediately honeybees. But honeybees are actually non-native. They were brought here from Europe, I think in the 1700s, to be used as kind of like a livestock to pollinate crops. So when we talk about native bees, there are, a huge number of diversity of different species that have very different traits than the honeybee. And so the differences between honeybees and native bees are really stark. There's some really big differences. So first, honeybees, of course, make honey, hence the name. They have a queen, they have workers, they have huge hives of like 20,000 individuals. They'll communicate food. There's this hierarchy, and honeybees are incredibly abundant. But native bees, they do not produce honey. They are mostly solitary. So they completely live on their own. They don't have any workers, nothing like that. It's just them and their eggs that they lay. And most of them are nesting either in the soil or in cavities. So they're not making these huge hives that everybody is really used to. And so here's just a kind of a picture of what the amazing diversity of bees in Ohio looks like. We go all the way from our super fuzzy honeybee or bumblebee here in the left corner. But we also have bees that are, bright metallic green. We have tiny bees that have really not a lot of hair at all. We have bright blue bees. We have bees that look like wasps. There's just a massive diversity, not only in the way they look, but also in the way that they behave. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's the largest North American bee. It's a carpenter bee, West Coast carpenter bee, and then a bee in the genus Perdita. So huge diversity in size as well. So I think we hear the term save the bees a lot. I know I personally have multiple articles of clothing that say save the bees, but what does this mean? What does it mean to save the bees? So a lot of people think about honeybees, and while honeybees may have issues in agricultural settings with like colony collapse syndrome, their population is doing just fine. When we say save the bees, we actually mean that other species of native bees populations are declining in their natural habitats. And because honeybees are very different from our native bees, the things that we would do to promote honeybees would be a little bit different than the things that we would do to promote our more native solitary bees. So there's just a lot more attention needs to be paid to natives so that we can preserve the diversity. There's an analogy that I like to use that if someone were to tell you that birds were declining, birds were going to go to extinct, you wouldn't go out and buy a bunch of chickens. And this is a similar thing with honeybees because honeybees are managed and they're used for certain human things. And it's not a fair comparison to compare honeybees and native bees. So why care about native bees at all? Honeybees can do it all, right? They can pollinate. Uh, well, our native species of plants actually have relationships with our native bees. These animals and plants have been evolving together for thousands of years, and so they're the best pollinators for our native plants, and they help maintain the diversity and the beauty that we have here in our native plants in the United States or in just Ohio. They produce a healthier ecosystem if you have many species of bees rather than just one, a super abundant species. Because honeybee may not be the best pollinator of something that's maybe super tiny because they're kind of a big bee. Um, so the more types of bees that you have, the more likely you are to have a healthier ecosystem because there are more plants, and all of the different things in ecosystems can work better when there's just more diversity. They're also just amazingly cool. If the pictures didn't prove that to you, whether it's bright green bees or blue bees, I think they are also really interesting in their behaviors and their traits. So when we want to uh, promote pollinators, we often focus on flowers. And this is really important. This is bees' main food source, so flowers are very important. And so we often plant flower gardens or pollinator gardens. But we often don't consider the nesting habitat for bees. And bees spend majority of their lives in the nest. So I think it's very important to also consider where they're nesting and to provide habitat for them to nest near a flower garden. So this is kind of like the crux of my interest. I'm incredibly interested in where bees nests and what they're kind of attracted to. We can lump them into four really large categories. First, we have our social nesters like honeybees, and we have our native bumblebees, which are social as well. We have parasitic bees, which we also call them cuckoo bees. And if you guys know anything about the cuckoo bird, it's very similar. These bees lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, and they just don't make a nest themselves at all. And then we have our largest group of bees, which is the ground nesters. These guys excavate tunnels in the soil. So they're making these intricate tunnels kind of down into the dirt. And then we have cavity nesters, which use like old stems or like cracks in rocks. Cavity nesters make up 20 to 30-ish% of bees. They You can see they usually are in this group called leafcutter bees, which use leaves to line the insides of their nests. Or you can see at the bottom picture there of the bee climbing into an old stem. And there's a lot of ways we can provide habitat for cavity nesters. I've personally seen these at different metro parks around the city. You can use like little bamboo straws or paper straws, and these can provide some habitat for our cavity nesting species. But what about our ground nesters? Um, Ground nesters make up 70 to 80% of all bees, and they are digging tunnels down into the soil, and underneath the soil, they can look incredibly different from each other depending on the species. So they can be really simplistic, like just one tunnel down into one cell, or they can be these intricate tunnel systems down underneath the soil. Here's a little bee I saw excavating her nest. So she's going down into the hole and she's using her little legs to push out the dirt. And so not only underneath the soil can they look diverse, but also on top of the soil. We get lots of different looks of what nest holes look like. So you can get them completely flushed with the ground. They can be as small as a pinprick. Some of these make really interesting little like chimneys. They're called turrets. Some of them are completely horizontal in like a riverbank. So they can be really very diverse. And it's hard to tell sometimes if it's a bee nest or if it's a nest to something else. So what kind of habitat can we provide for ground nesters? We have this idea for providing habitat for cavity nesters, but we don't really have the same for ground nesters. And so many researchers have posited different things like leaving the bare ground or adding some pebbles. Maybe they like to go underneath leaf litter or sloped ground. And this is what my research is all about. So urbanization is actually reduces the diversity, especially in ground nesting bees, because ground nesting bees need penetrable soil to make their nest. So there's a lot of, sidewalks and roads and buildings all in the urban space, and there's just not as much open area for them to choose a good nest spot. And I'm also curious at what is attracting bees to nest at the soil surface. So is it leaf litter? Is it pebbles? Is it just the plain bare ground? So I set up an experiment to test how both urbanization and then the soil surface substrates affect bee nesting. And I want to be able to provide a habitat in urban areas because these areas tend to not have the best bee nesting habitat for ground nesting bees. So for the design of the experiment, there are two major factors. First, urbanization, which is the percent of developed land at 500 meters from the site. I had 21 sites in total, and this kind of ranged from 0% developed land all the way up to 90% developed land. And then the plot manipulations included bare ground, mounded soil, pebbles, leaf litter, and then an unmanipulated control. And each of these treatments were applied 3 times per site. So there's a 3 by 5 meter plot with 3 different meters plots of each of these treatments. And then I would go back once a month and capture bees that were emerging from the nest holes, and then also take different readings on, the soil compaction and the soil moisture to see if those things also had a contributing factor. This is kind of what they looked like when they were all done. You may have seen them around at all these Columbus parks or flow spaces. You can see the different leaf litter, the mounded soils, the pebbles. This is at Clinton Como Park here. And then this is also at Clinton Como Park. This is what it looked like 2 days every other month. I would move these traps so that they were little tents that would cover the area of the plots. So any bees that were nesting in there would emerge and I would be able to see what they were. So very basic preliminary results. I went out last year from May to September, and then again in April this year, because I wanted to get some of those very unique spring bees. I collected a total of 196 bees that were nesting in my plots, which I think is pretty good, seeing that they could have been 0. So that was really exciting. The most colonized plots were the bare grounds and leaf litter, but all of the plots were significantly more abundant than the control plots, which is really exciting to see. I found 7 ground nesting genera and 2 parasitic genera in the plots. And then I'm still working on identifying them. And I have at least 20 species now, and I'm working on the hard species now. So there could even be a lot more. So you can obviously see there's a different colonization of the plot types. So I also did some statistical analyses. So first you can see this top graph. This is the probability of being uncolonized. And you can see that control and mound are almost at 100% likely to be uncolonized, but bare ground and leaf litter are much more likely. And similarly, the average number of bees found at bare ground and leaf were a lot higher than the rest of the plots. So there's also a significant negative effect of urbanization. So I found more bees in the less urban areas, which is not very surprising, but still very interesting. I also found that soil temperature and moisture were really important. Some of the bees that I found were mining bees, some sweat bees here, the bright green ones that make those little turrets. I found quite a few of those, some longhorn bees, and then a couple parasitic species. So what makes a site attractive for nesting for a bee? So I'd like to talk to you guys about the bee housing market. Bees, like us, kind of pick similar features to what we would like to choose in a home. First, it's about location, location, location. Bees require flowers. They leave the nest multiple times a day to go to a flower patch to forage, to drink the nectar, and then also to gather pollen for their eggs. So being close to a flower patch is really beneficial for bees. But there are other things to also consider. Is it easy to find? This can go one of two ways. Some bees like to nest in areas that are kind of hidden so that maybe parasitic species won't find them. And also they like to use visual cues like like a little piece of vegetation or a pebble to be able to find where their nest hole is. But then conversely, you can also see a lot of bees that are just nesting right out in the open, and it's a very specific type of bee. So some like to be out in the open, and other times they like to be kind of more concealed. Does it get a lot of sunlight? There has been a lot of different studies that have looked at kind of shade and sunlight on bees, and it's also really variable. Like I said, bees are incredibly diverse. So sometimes you get species that love it in the sun. They like it to be incredibly hot on the soil surface. But then other bees, they like to be in the shade. And I think this might also be context dependent. So maybe if you're in, Michigan versus South Carolina, you may get different results in that because it's hotter in some spaces than in others. And then also, is it structurally sound? Is it going to collapse? If the soil is too soft, it'll collapse. But then also, if the soil is too hard, it'll be hard to dig up and make those brood cells. And then also, will it flood? Bees have a waterproofing ability that they will line the cells with. But if you have standing water in an area, you're not going to be able to waterproof that. So all of these factors kind of go into what an individual bee is going to choose in their nesting site. So what can we do as individuals for bees? Of course, number one, flowers and native flowers. We love native species. Bees that are native here are usually more attracted to native flower species. But also we want to have many types of flowers. We don't want to just have one super abundant flower because, like I said before, there are a lot of different bees. They have a lot of different preferences for different flowers. And so if you have a lot of different flowering species, you are way more likely to have a lot of species of bees. And then finally, flowers that bloom at different times. So I think a lot of the times we plant gardens with heavy summer floral resources, but there are a lot of species that are only out in the spring, or there are a lot of species that are really out in the fall. So it's really important to have a variety of flowers that bloom at different times of the year. And then in terms of nesting habitat, my biggest piece of advice, because this is all still very up in the air, we don't really have a clear idea of what bees are choosing, where they're nesting. But from my experience and my research thus far, they are really diverse. They choose a lot of different things, and this could be on a species basis. So the more diverse habitat features you have, the more likely you are to have lots of different bees. So if you have some bare ground and maybe a little bit of leaf litter, some pebbles hanging around, maybe a dead tree stump, these are all different areas that bees can use for nesting. So with my experiment, I use bare ground, leaf litter, pebbles. These are all, preferred over those the control plots. But there are a lot of other things that bees may be using to nest around, depending on where you are. I think they just kind of find opportunistic places to nest that might just be good for them. They like the sunlight. They like, how soft the soil is. A lot of different things can go into it. And of course, no-mow areas. Lawns are kind of the worst place for bees to nest. There are maybe like one or two species that can nest in lawns, but in the whole, not really a lot of bees love a super dense vegetated area. And the thing with no-mow areas is you usually end up with a little bit of sparseness. So you'll get like this rich area of like grasses and flowers, but you'll also get a little bit of like bare areas as well. And those can all be used by bees. So all in all, native bees are our friends, and we need to find really good ways to promote our native bees. And with that, I can take questions about bee nesting and how to provide habitat. Stop sharing my screen.
Hey, Amber, this is Joe,
Hey.
not Petra. Um, did you, as a gardener, what I find one of the most, like when they built, say they built my house, they dig the foundation and they put the soil from that on top of the native soil. So if I want to grow something, I have to dig it up and decompress it and augment the soil. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so I was wondering if your experiment, did you um, do anything with the soil below the ground?
It's
Um,
really interesting that you say that because I had a plot at Delco Water Co. and they have this big mound that was excavated for a basement. And so it's like super dense clayey soil because it's like from the lower layers of the soil. And he said that he was not super successful in getting things to grow, like just really clover was growing up there, but I actually got a fair amount of bees nesting in there. So I think it just really maybe you need to look into what flowers will grow in that type of soil that you have. So kind of try to figure out it's probably really clay heavy and maybe figure out if there's some flowers that'll grow well in the clay. But, bees can nest in that type of area. They tend to like a more silty sandy soil, but if that's the soil you're working with, that's the soil you're working with, and you'll still be able to track some bees. For my project, I tilled up the dirt.
okay, you tilled it up.
Yeah, because I wanted to
Okay,
remove the vegetation. So it's mostly topsoil, but yeah, there's that one site that had like super deep clay soil.
right. Because, like you say, when they build a building or a house, they not only dig it up, but then they run a bulldozer over top of it, which gets it really compressed. So I was like where I've found nesting bees in my yard is in a section where I've actually gardened, and not usually not
Yeah.
the anyway. That, that was
Yes.
one.
So what I've found is that bees like soil compaction, kind of like Goldilocks. There's like this Goldilocks zone. So if it's too soft, they're not going to be there. If it's too hard, it's not going to be there. And that soil that you're talking about seems like it's probably super compact. And so one of the things that I did is like I tilled it up and it really makes it a lot softer, at least at the top. And that kind of helped, I think, initiate, or they liked it. They seem to like it. And I know that previous studies have actually found that bees do like tilled soil because it's like nice and soft
Yeah.
at the top.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Craig, you have a question?
Hi, I'm sorry. I had trouble logging in. I missed first couple minutes, so I hope you didn't answer these questions. But I had a question specifically about Ohio native bees.
Mhm.
Could you comment, if you didn't already, on any threatened or endangered species, or the whatever it's called, ICUN versus
Mm.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife status on Ohio bees?
Yes. So one of our projects in the Goodall Lab is actually we are documenting the first ever documented list of Ohio bees. And one of the big pieces of this project is figuring out what we have, but then also recommending species that are supposed to be here, but maybe we haven't found or we found so rare. So we have a couple recommendations that we're going to be giving the I can't remember the exact organization that we're working with this grant. Um, but we're going to recommend listing some of them.
Mhm.
Off the top of my head, I don't remember which ones they are, but it's like a handful of species that historically have been found here in abundance, but then we aren't really finding them anymore.
Okay.
And it's really hard to do this with solitary bees in general because there's just such a lack of knowledge of which species we have, but also how abundant they are. There's really no baseline data for this at all for our state. So we're doing the first baseline in our state ever. So we hope that that will then be like a nice benchmark for the future. But we also
Okay.
have a little bit of an idea of some species that are supposed to be here that may not be anymore that we're going to recommend once we finish the project. Yeah.
And are those listed in America by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service? Is that who officially, puts them on their list?
So we're not going to recommend for federal listing. I think it'll just be like like a threatened listing for the state or something
Or
of that nature.
vulnerable, something like that.
Yeah, like vulnerable on the ICUN or something of that nature.
Yeah.
Not the big federal one. Because the only bee on the federal list that we have or did have once was the rusty patch bumblebee.
Rusty patched.
Yep, it was here a long time ago.
Yeah, and that is extirpated in Ohio, isn't it?
Oh, completely. Yeah.
Yeah,
We
okay.
haven't seen it in over 10 years.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Amber.
Yeah. Did you take anybody else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
On identifying the bees, have you gone to iNaturalist? There's a Ohio Bee Project on there that might show some of the sightings.
That's probably us, actually. I'm assuming
Oh,
it.
are you the Ohio Bee Project?
I think we have the Ohio Specialist Bee Project and the Ohio Bee Bowl Survey Project. But for identifications, the bees that I'm identifying have to be done with a microscope currently. The ones I'm pretty good at it now, but I've worked pretty hard at getting good at it. But the ones I'm doing now, it's like the tiniest little details. So they're kind of hard to do if you don't have the actual specimen, which is unfortunate. But it is it is what we have to do. Sometimes we have to collect them. But yeah, we do post to iNaturalist quite a lot for our projects, and we have our coordinator Melissa Spreen. You may recognize her name if you've ever posted anything on iNaturalist in terms of bees. She has definitely identified it. So she's really active on there, and she's been working with us on this other project for the documenting all of Ohio, and we've been working with some volunteers for that as well.
Okay. My other question was, what did you use as your control substance or?
It was just completely unmanipulated. So whatever the site was before, that's what it was during the experiment.
So weeds or?
Yep, exactly the same. So I wanted to keep it as close to what the site was as possible. So I didn't want to touch it at all. The only thing I did was I cut down the weeds down to a certain level, so it wasn't like getting all crazy. Probably just for me, so it'd be easier and not like ripping apart my nets. But yeah, it was completely unmanipulated, and the other ones were, had all those different manipulations. So I wanted to see, how likely are you to attract something if you do, just these minor things like tilling up the soil and adding a few little rocks. And it was a lot. I was actually really surprised how many I got. I was really excited about it. I didn't tell you guys exactly what sites got what number of bees, because I have that at the end of the talk, but if somebody asked about it. But Sawmill Wetlands, if any of you have been there, it was like the most insane bee hub. I had like 80 bees nesting there. It was crazy. It made up like 1/3 of all of my observations. And there was a huge diversity too. It wasn't just like one species there. I got 3 species of like one specific genus of sweat bee, a bunch of other types of sweat bees. It was my longhorn bees that I caught there, my most excited ones that I love the most, I caught there. So really amazing site, Sawmill Wetlands. I'm not sure what it is about it. I have some preliminary ideas, but I'm not exactly sure.
I think our sawmill volunteers would probably say it's all their wonderful pollinator gardens.
Oh, probably. It really has amazing flowers there. So that's probably the best. It's probably one of the biggest contributing factors there.
You have another question?
Joe again?
Yep. Hey, Amber, just a comment. I really liked your comment about all the different sizes and types of bees versus all the plants and stuff. I never thought about it that way. But a honeybee is just this one size beast, and so to pollinate the rest of our plants takes all these different diverse bees. So I thought that was a really good comment. So
yeah, thank you. It is something to think about. Like when you go out and look at your garden, or out at any kind of like metro park or anything that has flowers, there's so many different types of flowers. There's like those little tiny ones, there's like huge ones, and we need lots of different bees to pollinate those. There's actually this one type of pollination called buzz pollination that only bumblebees can do. And it's really important for like things in the blueberry family, and like cranberries too. There's a couple other like native plants that require this like buzz pollination. These bumblebees will like grab a hold of the flower and just like and like really buzz and get the pollen off. So they're the only ones that can do that. And you know, honeybees can't really get those really super tiny ones either, the super tiny flowers.
Right. When you think about it, you look at the bees, there's those teeny tiny ones, and then you've got these great big carpenter bees and
Yeah, I know. It's crazy how
these
different they are.
bumblebees and
Mhm.
everything in between. So
Oh yes,
with
huge
different,
range.
with different tongue lengths and
They do
whatever,
have different tongues.
So anyways, I like that.
Yeah, they're all very much catered to the species of flowers they really like. And another project that I'm actively working on is called the Specialist Bee Project, where we look for bees they're called specialists, and they only visit one type of plant, and they're like the best pollinator for that one type of plant. So those are also really important, and they're usually rarer than our more generalist bees, like a honeybee or a bumblebee. So it's really important to be able to have specialist flowers in certain sites. So diverse flowers usually have some of those more specialized plant.
I wondered, did you notice anything this spring? The degree days is way ahead of any years I've monitored.
Mhm.
Was there any mistiming of flowers and bees that
Yeah,
goes on?
it was a weird spring. I really wanted to do surveying in March, but it was so rainy and it got really cold and it just wasn't good. And then when I went out in the spring, it was really variable. The weather was kind of crazy. It was just like raining for 4 days, and then it would be like 80 degrees, 40 degrees. So it was kind of crazy.
Because we're plus over 700 degree days now, and 5 years ago we were at about 450. So,
Yeah.
and nothing's that, like I say, that I've tracked compares to how far we are along this
Oh
year.
yeah.
And
There
so
are some, so like I said about the Specialist Bee Project, there are certain specialists that specialize on spring ephemerals. And spring ephemerals this year were like, gone in like 2 seconds. It was like so fast. They were up and done in like a week or two. It was crazy. And it was way earlier than we were expecting. It was kind of like, we were like, oh no, we have to start doing field work now. So that was, it was really crazy. And, the weather, a lot of people do worry about mismatching of flowers and bees, but research as of right now is inconclusive about if this is going to be a problem. I think most research finds that if a flower is early to bloom, a bee will be early to emerge because they're so like highly linked with that relationship. They kind of really,
it's
it's
true.
it's very temperature dependent, like if it has like 3 warm days and that flower is blooming, that bee is going to be up too. So
Thanks.
yeah, I have a question in the chat. It says, what are some examples of specialist plant species? So there are a lot, like hundreds of plants that host specialists. So currently, I'm actually out in Toledo right now doing field work for a couple of days, looking at hydrophyllum, and this is waterleaf. So there's a bunch of different species of waterleaf all over Ohio, and we have a specialist bee on that. Other species that I have looked at are Claytonia virginica, which is a spring beauty. Violets is another spring, geranium. Really, a majority of flowers have some kind of specialist on it. Everything in the aster family, which is like the biggest family of flowers, hosts a whole suite of different specialists. They are really abundant. So because asters are so common, they tend to have a lot of different species that visit them and have a lot of specialists on them as well. So we actually have a guidebook for the specialist bees of Ohio. Maybe I can go find a link and I can drop it in the chat. It's called the Specialist Bee Guide of Ohio. One of the coordinators of the Ohio bee survey was actually the one who put this together. Let me grab it now and I'll drop it in the chat. And this has a list of all of the different flower species that are specialized on and the bees that are on them. Any other questions about research, about how cool bees are?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Are there any people now that as they are beginning to develop pollinator gardens, things like that, where they are actually manipulating the soil as part of it to
Um,
attract bees?
Not really. So it's just one of those things that's not really done a lot yet. So I think there's this massive gap of knowledge that we have about bee nesting in general. We don't really know where they're nesting, why they're nesting there, especially for ground nesters. We just like don't know. Because they're really hard to find. Like some of these bees are like no more than 4 millimeters. Their nest hole is like the size of a pinprick. How are you supposed to find that and study that? And they're solitary. So it's like it's really hard sometimes to find these bees and to figure out where they're nesting. And there have been some studies like research that looks into things with like different soil textures or manipulating the soil surface like kind of like mine, like adding pebbles and stuff. But currently I don't know a lot of pollinator gardens themselves like done by like parks or anything that are actually adding or manipulating nesting features yet. But I would like to see that happen. I would really like to see that happen. I would love some diversity of different spots around the pollinator garden that might be attractive for the ground nesting bees. But I do understand logistically it's really hard to keep a space vegetated. So like I hand weeded once a month and it was a lot of work. So I think some sites are a lot easier than others, like if they have sparse vegetation to begin with. Um, so logistically, it might be more difficult than just planting flowers, but I think it's a worthy effort.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. I have another question in the chat. It's have you had a chance to evaluate the diversity that you see versus the size of the pollinator areas or the diversity of the plants? So part of my project is I did do some floral surveys. And then also I have some landscape type analyses where I look at like the patch of the land. One of the kind of preliminary things that I thought that we would see is that I thought we would find more pollinators in the urban areas because there's less area for them to nest in. So something super attractive would be a highly colonized. So Solomon Wetlands is the most urbanized site that I have, and it was the most diverse and abundant. But in terms of all of the other sites, they weren't. So I'm also accounting for diversity and of the flowers, and then also kind of the size of like the nearby flower patches. And I do truly think that like the closeness to the flower patch is a really important factor. I have another question in the chat. It says, can you comment on the general distances between nesting sites that might be ideal? I can absolutely do that. I have studied this in great length. So the rule of thumb that has been suggested is 150 meters for species. So most species kind of nest really locally, especially solitary bees. So things like bumblebees and honeybees, they can nest pretty far away from their floral patches because they have workers doing all the work, right? So they have the queen staying in the nest and she's laying her eggs, but the workers get to go out. They can fly super far. They're also really large. There is a huge correlation between body size and flight distance that they will do for foraging. So bumblebees can go up to like a kilometer, maybe a kilometer and a half if they're really searching. But for solitary bees, they like to stay really close to home. They don't want to go that far because the further you go, the more energy it's taking and the less eggs you can produce. So for those like tiny little sweat bees, they're not going really over 100 meters, maybe 200 meters. So the recommendation that I always see is like 200 to 500 meters between well, if 500 meters is a good benchmark for pollinator garden distances. But in terms of bees, they're nesting quite locally, usually. So within 200 meters for those smaller bees.
I had another comment kind of on Bob's comment about the soil again. I'm into the
Mhm.
soil.
Mhm.
Every time, or I should say every time, most of the time when I go to make a garden plot, I find the compacted urban soil, and then I manipulate that soil before I plant. It would be interesting to have research on, like, before somebody's going to make a garden, to put just put your tents up and see if there's anything there,
Mhm.
and then see what it's like after the soil's manipulated. Um, for instance, like this morning, I was at Chadwick Arboretum, where you would think you would have beautiful soil, but you don't. It's your typical
Mhm.
urban soil, compacted clay, and you have to dig it. And then, like this morning, I added zoo brew to it. So I'm really manipulating that soil before I try to plant into it, or it's like planting into a concrete driveway.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I have a
anyway,
site at Chadwick and it was like not colonized at all. It was like think I found like one bee.
right, you were, yeah, your plot there at the Arb North, all that soil is, when they built 315, it was manipulated, and when they built the hospitals, they put or take dirt, especially when they were building James. So and then they topped it off with an inch or two of topsoil on top of that.
So when you say
That's
manipulating the soil to garden, what kind of manipulations are you doing? Are you adding things like sand? Are you like tilling it
uh,
up?
I'm gonna dig it to the depth of a shovel, about a foot, and turn it over, break it open to let some air and water into it.
Mhm.
Then I take some kind of additive, like in this case, it was Zoo Brew. The the Price Farms takes the material from the zoo and composts it, and then I put that in, and turn that all in, and then I plant into that. So
Mhm.
that's what I mean. Like, when you tilled it, you manipulated the soil. That's what you
Yeah,
did.
yeah, yeah. They seem to be a lot more attracted to the tilled soil. And this has been found in previous research as well. They just tend to like the softer start.
Yeah. Okay. Just
Goodness.
comment.
Yeah. I got a question in the chat. It says, when is your dissertation be available? That's a hard question. So I'm coming up on my 4th year. And my goal for the end of the summer is to have written up 2 of my 3 chapters of my dissertation. So hoping that I get that done by the end of the summer. And I'm hoping to publish those before I graduate. So I'm hoping to publish all 3 of my projects before I leave the university at all. So hopefully they'll all be done before the dissertation actually comes all together. So whenever I publish, I will send you guys like an email through Flow, and you guys could send that around. Any other questions?
You mentioned using a microscope to identify some of the species.
Mhm.
What kind of things do you look for?
Yeah, it's crazy. So there's a lot of different features, and it really depends on the species you're looking at, or the genus, really. So for these really hard ones, they have these, one of the biggest features that they use are the pits on their exoskeleton. So they have these little holes like pores. They're also like hold hairs, and the distance between those pits and like the size of those pits is super indicative of a species. But of course, that needs to be really highly magnified, especially when it's like a 4 millimeter bee. It's like so tiny. You have to have really high magnification to look at it. And it really depends on the genus. There are a lot of different ways to identify different genera. So some of them use the hair color, some of them use the hair placement, some of them use these pits, some of them use, I don't even know the distance, the size of the antennae. It's really variable between genera. And some of them are way easier than others. So some of them you can just bust it out really quick. Immediately you can look at it and be like, I know this species. But then some of them you take like 2 weeks to really mull it over. So it is very variable. There are a lot of different things to look at. And if you've ever read a bee taxonomy key or any insect taxonomy key, they are really dense and hard to read because entomologists love to make up words to describe things. And so they'll use really crazy words to describe what they're trying to talk about. Any other questions? If not, that's all I have for you. And I'm really excited that you guys came out. And
Thank you so
thanks.
much, Amber. We've been waiting anxiously to hear these results, and it's very exciting to.
Yeah, I'm going to present them at the Entomological Society of America in November, this project, which is really exciting. I actually got invited to do a symposium. So that means that we all do little talks all about ground nesting bee conservation. And then we get to talk like Q&A style. So it'll be really fun. I'm really excited about that. And hopefully I'll be working on writing this up so I can actually publish it and then people can actually read the whole thing.
Great.
Thanks, Amber. It was great.
Yeah. So
Thank you. And if you guys
again.
have any questions, here, I'll put my email in the chat. And you can always email me with literally anything. If you're just like curious about what bee this is in your yard, I love to look at pictures of people's yard bees, or, you know, how to build something that you want to attract pollinators to. So just, you're totally welcome to email me.
Well, thanks so much.